Initially an innocuous fantasy, it rapidly became a dangerous obsession. A couple's wife-swapping experiment was thrilling at first, but it set off a risky sequence of events that nobody could have anticipated. An infatuation and jealousy took hold, and the situation turned into a horrific murder. We explore the bizarre tale of how a fantasy turned into a nightmare and how a fatal obsession claimed lives in this true crime documentary. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment below if you enjoy reading about stories of love, obsession, and tragic outcomes. We can tell more compelling real crime stories thanks to your support. The horrific murder of Jennifer Johnson shocked the residents of Pine Hill, a sleepy, lovely village. This seemingly quiet, close-knit suburban community was rocked by a crime of passion and betrayal that exposed the murky side of seemingly perfect lives. Two couples' lives, Mark and Jennifer Johnson and Daniel and Linda Garner, intertwined in ways that would eventually result in infatuation, dishonesty, and violence. And finally, killing. Daniel Garner, an esteemed architect, was well known for his endearing personality and seemingly flawless union with Linda, a committed educator. The Garners' closest companions were Mark Johnson, a prosperous financial planner, and his spouse, Jennifer. Beyond just weekend vacations and neighborhood cookouts, the two couples had more in common. Additionally, they participated in a voluntary system of exchanging wives, which at first added excitement and variety to their lives. But beneath the surface of this unusual way of living, there were dangerous feelings simmering. Linda, Daniel's wife, was painfully aware of his growing addiction as his curiosity with Jennifer turned into an all-consuming obsession. Sensing Daniel's passion, Jennifer made the decision to terminate the partnership. Her decision was made without considering the devastating implications it would cause. After 10 years of marriage, Daniel and Linda Garner's union seemed to be a picture of stability and contentment to others. Daniel was a well-known and accomplished architect who possessed a captivating demeanor and inventive creations. Linda taught third grade, and her students adored her. Well esteemed by her peers. Linda took great delight in her well-kept garden, which surrounded their quaint home on Maple Street. 5 years ago, Mark and Jennifer Johnson moved to Pine Hill and made friends with the Garners right away. Financial advisor Mark was gregarious and kind. With her stunning appearance and captivating demeanor, Jennifer was often the life of the party and enjoyed equal popularity. With the Johnsons' arrival, the neighborhood took on a new energy, and their friendship with the Garners developed out of respect and common interests. The first mention of wife swapping occurred during the Garners' dinner party. Driven by wine and a spirit of exploration, the subject of open partnerships came up. To the amazement of all. Rather than shock, they were curious about the concept. In the ensuing weeks, the concept was given additional thought, and everyone agreed on ground rules and boundaries to protect their core relationships. The initial meeting was exhilarating but uneasy. For the evening, Daniel and Jennifer and Mark and Linda switched partners. The experience was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. However, it left them wanting more. What was once only an occasional experiment quickly turned into a daily aspect of their life, adding a spark to both marriages. At first, the plan appeared to be effective. Both pairs seemed more content and bonded. They continued their social engagements. Their secret was closely kept, mentioned only in their homes or at private events. They frequently hosted joint parties and took holidays together. There was an excitement that came with the arrangement's novelty, and for a while it appeared like they had struck the right balance. But as the months went by, little alterations started to show, especially in Daniel's actions. He began to express an extraordinary level of interest in Jennifer. Linda observed his growing obsession, which he frequently used as an excuse to spend time alone with her, but she decided to overlook it in the hopes that it would pass. Mark didn't seem to see the tension building either. Though the others were unaware of it, Daniel's fascination with Jennifer was evolving into something more sinister. He discovered that he couldn't stop thinking about her, reliving their interactions and wishing he had more time to spend with her. An innocuous adventure was gradually turning into an obsession that would have disastrous effects on everyone concerned. Daniel had developed an all-consuming passion with Jennifer, making his fascination with her more than just a passing delight. He couldn't stop thinking about her, reminiscing about their interactions at family dinners and business meetings. His passion, his architectural ambitions, now seemed less important than his desire to be with Jennifer. He began looking for ways to be close to her, offering to assist with chores that Mark typically took care of or making more frequent invitations for the Johnsons to stay. Linda started to see her husband's transformation. She initially put it down to the excitement of their new way of life, but it quickly became apparent that Daniel was more interested in Jennifer than they had agreed. When they weren't with the Johnsons, he grew agitated and aloof, and his talks would frequently focus on Jennifer's preferences, oddities, and routines. Linda confronted Daniel one evening as they were clearing away from a dinner party. He responded defensively, brushing off her worries as jealousy. Linda let it drop, but continued to watch him closely so as not to upset the delicate balance they had built. His habit of fixing his long, unneeded stares on Jennifer during parties only deepened her suspicions. Jennifer also started to notice Daniel's increasing fixation. She was flattered by his attention for a moment, but then she felt awkward. His words became less acceptable and his touches more possessive. When she confided in Mark about her unease, he dismissed it, assuming Daniel was simply more affectionate. Mark's casual demeanor made Jennifer feel alone in her worries. A weekend getaway to a lakeside cabin marked a turning point in the situation. The retreat was organized by the couples as a means to unwind and spend some time apart from one another. But the vacation did nothing but emphasize Daniel's obsession. By insistence on bringing Jennifer out on the lake by herself and abandoning Mark and Linda, he took full advantage of Jennifer's time. There was a noticeable tension, and Daniel subtly resisted Jennifer's attempts to put distance between them. Daniel crossed the line with a comment he made one evening while sitting by the fire. He talked about making a fresh start and letting everything go. Only the two of them. Startled and uneasy, Jennifer excused herself and headed straight to bed. After listening in on the conversation, Linda confronted Daniel once more. Even though he was less contemptuous this time, he would not admit how deeply he felt. Linda became further irritated upon realizing the depth of Daniel's fixation. She was in love with her husband, but she also knew that their friendship with the Johnsons and their marriage may be destroyed by his obsession with Jennifer. Her attempts to step in failed, and Daniel's actions just got wilder. He began to follow Jennifer around, attending her yoga lessons in addition to their scheduled appointments. Jennifer became terrified even though she pretended to be a casual visitor at her place of employment. She confided in a close friend, who suggested that she keep as much distance from Daniel as possible. Jennifer made the decision to completely terminate the agreement in an effort to seize control. She thought that if she did this, Daniel might wake up. And none of them would have to hurt anyone more after this chapter. One evening, Daniel unexpectedly dropped by the Johnsons' home while Mark was away on a business trip. Though shocked, Jennifer allowed him in the hopes of averting a confrontation. In the living room, they took a seat. Daniel revealed his affections for her at an intensely tense moment, talking about a time when they could be together in public. Horrified, Jennifer attempted to talk sense into his head by telling him that their arrangement was never intended to last longer than a brief thrill. Jennifer's apprehension transformed into rage as Daniel's statements grew more forceful. She came to the realization that she had to stop this. Prior to it destroying her friendship with Linda and her husband. She made it clear to Daniel that their arrangement was ending and that he should respect her limits as well as her marriage. Jennifer resisted Daniel's attempts to talk her out of it, even though Daniel was obviously shaken. Jennifer stayed away from Daniel for the following few days in the hopes that he would change his mind. Linda listened to her confession with a troubled heart. Although Linda wanted to help Jennifer, she also felt a perverse devotion to Daniel because she knew her husband's attachment had reached an unhealthy level. She assured Jennifer that she would speak with him in an attempt to defuse the situation. But Daniel's fixation simply grew more intense. He began to arrive at Jennifer's place of employment and wait for her after work. And sending her notes declaring his unwavering devotion. Feeling more and more uncomfortable, Jennifer made the decision to approach him one last time in the hopes that he would see the seriousness of his conduct. They got together in a quiet area far from prying eyes. Jennifer restated that his behavior was inappropriate and that their agreement was terminated. She begged him to go on and let go. Daniel became desperate because he couldn't accept her rejection. She was manipulating his feelings and luring him on, he claimed. Keeping her cool, Jennifer demanded that they separate and go back to their own marriages. They had no idea that Linda had trailed Daniel to the park. She stood back and watched the altercation play out, her heart racing. She saw the resolve on Jennifer's face and the agony on Daniel's. Linda was aware that this exchange would inevitably occur. However, she was also afraid of what might come next. Daniel's despair turned to anger as the dispute grew more heated. To have Jennifer reject his fantasies felt like a betrayal on a personal level. Using foul language, he yelled at her, telling her that she had ruined his life. Jennifer held her ground, fighting back tears. Refusing to give in to fear. A wave of panic shot through Linda as she watched from the shadows. She was aware that she had to step in before things went out of control. She emerged from her hiding spot and walked up to the two, calling out to Daniel with a trembling voice. Daniel appeared to be relieved and confused when he saw Linda, as if seeing her would put an end to his fury. Jennifer moved away, seizing the opportunity to divert attention. Resolved to keep her distance from Daniel as much as possible. Now that she and her husband were alone, Linda attempted to soothe him. They would find a way to get over this, she promised him, but deep inside she knew that their lives had been irreversibly changed. Jennifer's choice to terminate the arrangement had started a series of events that could not be reversed, and the affair had reached its breaking point. After everything had settled, it would become clear how deeply involved Linda was and how much of an infatuation Daniel really had, which would ultimately lead to a terrible and violent ending. Daniel was inconsolable after the altercation in the park. He was completely taken aback by Linda's sudden entrance and Jennifer's stern denial. That evening, he came home to a maelstrom of betrayal, fury, and sorrow in his mind. Linda sensed that a storm was building inside of Daniel and attempted to calm his racing mind, but Daniel refused to listen. Daniel grew more and more irregular in his behavior over the next 3 days. He alternated between fits of deep despair and furious outbursts. His days were consumed by his fixation with Jennifer's rejection and the apparent injustices he had experienced. He quit his job. Unable to get through to him, Linda sensed her own anxiety and frustration mounting. Something has to give, she knew. However, she was unprepared for the abrupt change in the course of events. Jennifer, though, was determined to make progress. She stayed away from Daniel at all costs, concentrating instead on her career and her bond with Mark. She was afraid of her husband's response and the possible consequences, so she hadn't disclosed to him the whole degree of Daniel's preoccupation. By severing their relationship, she believed Daniel would finally accept the end of their arrangement and go away. When Jennifer got home one evening from work, Daniel was waiting for her outside her house. The sight of him made her heart sink, and she braced herself for further conflict. She stepped closer to him. She told him to go, her voice stern yet steady. Daniel implored her for one final chance to explain himself, his eyes wild with desperation. Sensing the talk was pointless, Jennifer attempted to get past him, but Daniel took hold of her arm. Jennifer noticed that he was insane, and his hold was painfully tight. She strained to release herself. She demanded he release his grip, her voice increasing. Someone in the neighborhood heard the boom and went outside to investigate. When Daniel saw the neighbor, he let Jennifer go and ran away. Shaken and terrified, Jennifer thanked her neighbor and ran inside. In an attempt to find a solution without calling the cops, she gave Linda a call. Jennifer expressed fear to Linda, and Linda agreed to meet with her the next day to talk about how to deal with Daniel's ever more erratic conduct. Linda met Jennifer in a nearby cafe the following day. Jennifer described the meeting with Daniel and her mounting concern for her safety, appearing worn out and anxious. Linda listened carefully, trying to come up with a solution as her thoughts raced. She will speak with Daniel, she had assured Jennifer, and convey to him the conclusion of their relationship. When Linda got home from the conference, she discovered Daniel agitated. Her voice was a mixture of worry and rage as she addressed him about the event with Jennifer. Sensing he was surrounded, Daniel yelled at her, calling her a traitor for siding with Jennifer. The dispute intensified, and Linda withdrew to their bedroom, frightened for her own safety. Daniel's thoughts were darker that evening. He was unable to understand that his own wife was against him and that Jennifer had rejected him. In his deranged mind, he thought that removing the cause of his suffering was the only way to make things right. He came to the conclusion that nobody could have Jennifer if he couldn't. Daniel arrived at the Johnsons' home on a clear, cool night. He was aware that Mark was alone in the city, leaving Jennifer. He entered the bedroom through a side window and proceeded to where Jennifer was sleeping. His anger and despair were increased by seeing her, content and oblivious. With a jumbled mixture of hate and love racing through his head, he reached over to her with a kitchen knife. When Jennifer woke up, Daniel was standing over her and the knife was shining in the low light. She attempted to scream, but Daniel covered her mouth, his grip strong and unyielding. He stabbed her in the chest out of wrath, stopping her cries. Daniel stood over Jennifer, her life slipping away, his head a jumble of contradictory feelings. After Jennifer was killed, Daniel left the scene with Jennifer's blood on his hands. When he got home, Linda discovered him shaking and unable to speak. She knew right away what he had done, and in a fit of misplaced loyalty, she chose to assist him in hiding the crime. Their constructed life, all of their secrets were in jeopardy. Linda realized they had to take swift, determined action if they were to survive. Driven by a perverse sense of self-preservation and allegiance, Linda assumed command of the situation. She told Daniel to take off his clothing and wash the blood off before leading him to the restroom. Her thoughts were filled with the gravity of their situation. She was aware that they needed to move quickly to hide the crime and safeguard their covert existence. Linda gathered Daniel's clothes and put them in a plastic bag while he stood under the hot shower, the water turning pink around his feet. She washed the area where he had walked, being careful to remove any bloodstains. After cleaning him off, she made him sit down and tell her the entire story of what had transpired. Daniel gave a sobering narrative despite his emotional state, his voice quivering from the gravity of what he had done. Linda thought of a scheme. They had to get rid of any evidence that connected them to the crime and come up with an alibi. She dialed a reliable pal. Making the claim that Daniel had been with her the entire time, they made sure their alibi was supported. She then took a car to a remote part of the town, where she set fire to the murder weapon and Daniel's bloodstained clothing, hoping that the flames would destroy any last bits of evidence. Everyone in the area, including the Garners, was questioned by the police. Linda's well-constructed alibi held up to closer inspection, and Daniel, though clearly upset, avoided arousing suspicion. With no solid leads leading to the Garners, the inquiry appeared to come to a standstill. Even though they were initially successful in avoiding the police, the psychological impact of the murder weighed heavily on both Daniel and Linda. Daniel was convinced that the police were pursuing him, which made him more and more paranoid. He distanced himself from associates and friends. Though she maintained her composure, Linda could feel the weight of their secret bearing down on her as he tangled himself up in a web of regret and terror. She went into overdrive, observing every move and conversation for clues that anyone nearby might be suspicious. For the Garners, the weeks that followed Jennifer's death were a swirl of stress and deceit. As the stabilizing force, Linda kept Daniel's anxieties under control while making sure their public persona held firm. She was happy that the police didn't appear to have any strong leads as she kept an eye on the news for any updates on the inquiry. But Linda realized they needed more than an alibi to keep their cover intact. They had to come up with a story that would take the focus off on Daniel. She recommended to Daniel that he show greater grief over Jennifer's passing. To dispel any doubt and to sympathize with the suffering of the community. Daniel acted as the bereaved buddy at parties and neighborhood meetings. With a mixture of nostalgia and sadness, he spoke about Jennifer, frequently shedding tears. Mark, inconsolable and in need of clarification. Never suspected his friend's role in his wife's passing, but he did seem to value Daniel's sensitivity. Daniel's mental health continued to worsen, and his guilt began to show themselves as hallucinations and nightmares. He began abusing alcohol severely in an attempt to find comfort in it, but his escape was fleeting. Linda watched him carefully, frequently staying up late to make sure he didn't leave the house out of fear that he could confess in a drunken stupor. Daniel broke down one evening while he was hunched over a drink of alcohol. He told Linda that he had to come clean because he could no longer bear the guilt. Terrified, Linda attempted to reassure him. Linda advised that they go for a quick vacation outside of town to help them keep their cool. After making their way to a remote home in the Highlands, they wishing Daniel would benefit from the change of scenery. They were able to plot their next course of action during their brief period of relief from the ongoing probe, thanks to the seclusion. Linda emphasized the value of their confidentiality to them while they were at the cabin. She gave Daniel advice on how to respond to questions from the police and deal with the public. Linda relentlessly drove him to reply without hesitation, probing him until he could, all the while being driven by her desire to preserve their way of life and keep them out of jail. The Garners continued their life in Pine Hill with a fresh sense of direction. Even though he was still troubled by what he had done, Daniel was able to put up a stronger front. Linda kept an eye on their dealings with the public, making sure they stayed out of trouble. But their facade was starting to show some cracks. When friends and neighbors saw Daniel's increased alcohol use and unpredictable conduct, rumors that he might have been involved in Jennifer's death started to spread. Constantly on guard, Linda tried to dispel the allegations. But she was aware that their time was limited. As the police inquiry went forward, more information surfaced that suggested Daniel's alibi was inconsistent. The truth was closer to being disclosed than it had ever been, and the world the Garners had painstakingly built was about to crumble. Detective Mitchell conducted separate interviews with the Garners, taking note of any inconsistencies in their accounts. Under close examination, Linda's well-constructed alibi stood up, and Daniel's emotional state was consistent with that of a buddy going through a difficult time. But Mitchell had a gut feeling that there was more to this story. New evidence surfaced throughout the course of the weeks. Daniel's fixation with Jennifer was evident in a string of increasingly desperate texts that he sent, according to forensic examination of Jennifer's phone records. Mitchell pulled Daniel in for more interrogation, probing him on the details of his relationship with Jennifer and the contradictions in his alibi. Struggling to remain composed, Daniel repeated the narrative Linda had instructed him to tell, but the investigator's misgivings were only stoked by his trepidation and evasive responses. The pivotal moment occurred when a neighbor disclosed important information. On the night of the murder, they had noticed Daniel's automobile parked close to the Johnsons' residence and recalled his odd conduct. The forensic evidence, this testimony, and Daniel's unpredictable behavior were sufficient for the police to get a search warrant for the Garners' house. Even though Linda had cleaned everything thoroughly, the police discovered during the search that there was still evidence of charred clothing and blood that had seeped into the flooring. Struggling to remain composed, Daniel repeated the narrative Linda had instructed him to tell, but the investigator's misgivings were only stoked by his trepidation and evasive responses. The pivotal moment occurred when a neighbor disclosed important information. On the night of the murder, they had noticed Daniel's automobile parked close to the Johnsons' residence and recalled his odd conduct. The forensic evidence, this testimony, and Daniel's unpredictable behavior were sufficient for the police to get a search warrant for the Garners' house. Even though Linda had cleaned everything thoroughly, the police discovered during the search that there was still evidence of charred clothing and blood that had seeped into the flooring. Daniel's culpability was made abundantly evident by this incriminating evidence, which was supported by the phone records and witness accounts. The Garners were getting closer to the net. And Linda knew that their carefully manicured facade was going to fall apart. She was aware that devising a fresh strategy that would place the responsibility elsewhere rather than on them would be their only opportunity to avoid serving a long prison term. Linda and Daniel had to face the harsh facts of their situation as the cops drew closer. The truth was about to come to light in a way they could never have predicted, and the falsehoods and deceit that had once shielded them threatened to fall apart entirely. As Daniel's case grew more substantial, Detective Mitchell prepared to make her move. She summoned Daniel in for more interrogation, but she asked him questions in a different way this time. She arranged every piece of evidence they had collected. The forensic results, the witness statements, and the phone logs. Confronted and overpowered, Daniel started to crumble under the strain. Mitchell persisted, implying that Daniel might be given a lighter sentence if he confessed. Daniel eventually lost it because he was too overwhelmed by his remorse and the constant interrogation. He described his infatuation as he confessed to killing Jennifer. The altercation and the instant he lost it. But Daniel also named Linda in his confession, exposing her complicity in the crime's cover-up. He told how she had assisted him with clearing the area, getting rid of evidence, and creating an alibi. Perceiving the chance to obtain the complete account, Mitchell also brought Linda in for interrogation. Linda first denied any involvement when confronted with Daniel's confession, but as Mitchell went over the evidence in Daniel's narrative, Linda came to the realization that there was no turning back. Her skillfully crafted lies had finally come undone. She came clean about her assistance to Daniel, stating that it was motivated by a misplaced sense of loyalty and her fear of losing everything they had worked so hard to create. Pine Hill and the surrounding area were enthralled with the Daniel and Linda Garner trial. The courtroom was full of reporters and interested spectators. Anxious to bring the tragic story to an end, Linda, who was accused of obstruction of justice and accessory to murder, and Daniel, who was accused of first-degree murder, both entered guilty pleas. Daniel received a life sentence without the chance of release. Thanks to her cooperation with the investigation and her prior spotless record, Linda was given a lesser sentence despite her involvement in the cover-up. She received a sentence of 15 years in jail, with 10 years of release possible. After leaving to gather the pieces of his broken life, Mark Johnson took some comfort in the fact that justice had been done, but he never stopped grieving for his wife.